Estás escuchando Encuentros Políticos. You're listening to Political Encounters on USLA Radio, a show focused on discussing political issues and taking action in Philadelphia's Latinx communities and beyond. I'm Edwin Mayorga, PhD. Today's episode is titled Pandemic Schooling for Justice, Part 1. As schools across the U.S. are figuring out plans for reopening this coming fall, families are thinking about what educational options they have available to them, including pandemic pods or micro-schooling pods for the fall, in which groups of 3 to 10 students learn together in homes under the tutelage of the children's parents or a hired teacher, or in other cases, families are using pods as a supplement to their school's online curricula. This has raised a number of questions regarding access and equity for millions of students. To provide us more perspective, I'm pleased to have social scientists and parents, Dr. Erica O. Turner, Dr. LaRue Lewis McCoy, and joining us by phone, Dr. Blanca Vega, or maybe in and out with phone. Very quickly, Erica O. Turner is an associate professor of education policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She studies how diverse groups, from school district leaders to students to community members, make sense of and act on education problems, policies, equity, and justice amidst shifting social, political, and economic contexts. Her book, Suddenly Diverse, How School Districts Manage Race and Inequality, from University of Chicago Press in 2020, examines how 2 Midwestern school districts respond to demographic change in their schools. LaRue Lewis McCoy, who also goes by Doomy, is a sociologist at New York University in the School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His central line of research concentrates on educational inequality, particularly focused on the intersecting roles of race, class, and place. His first book, Inequality in the Promised Land, examined the experiences of low-income and racial minority families' attempts at accessing school-related resources in an affluent suburb. He's currently fielding a study in Westchester County, New York, and is working on a book, Stealing School, which tackles opportunity hoarding in multiple contexts. Joining us from New Jersey is Dr. Blanca Vega, who's an assistant professor in higher education in the Department of Counseling and Educational Leadership at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Dr. Vega's scholarship broadly focuses on equity, access, and success in higher education among undeserved populations. Her primary area of research situates racism as one of multiple barriers that can impact higher education experiences and success, not just for students, but also for administrators and faculty. She's currently studying perceptions of racial conflict in higher education. Most recent publications have focused on the importance of Black spaces in higher education as a response to racial conflict. She's currently working on a paper that explores and compares perceptions of racial conflict between administrators and students. Welcome, all 3 of you.
Thanks for having us.
So there's a lot to discuss, but let's just kind of jump into what is pandemic podding, micro-schooling. Tell us, what is that and why do we need it, or do we need it?
So I'll start off. So pandemic pods or micro schools, whatever you want to call them, learning pods, are a thing that are becoming very popular in this moment of uncertainty. When you look around the United States in particular, parents are very confused whether schools are going to be open, whether schools are going to be face-to-face, or maybe they're hybrid, some in and out or completely online. And the amount of uncertainty that we have nationally around schools being open has led to the cropping up of these pandemic pods, which are often kind of trying to create environments that are safe from coronavirus. So they're small in number, usually 3 to 5 families. And the idea is to give children a stable environment to learn in, to give them a chance to have social interaction. But there are also particular forms of pandemic pods that are where more affluent families or families that have greater resources are not just getting kids together to learn, but they're hiring private tutors, they're hiring private teachers, and even in some cases, renting private spaces. And so in this moment where most families in American schools are unsure of what's happening, pandemic pods have emerged as a response to attempt to stabilize, but that stabilizing can actually be the very grounds for reproducing inequality that's already all over our country.
I mean, I think it's just to underscore something that Doomy said there. I think, it's a little bit, the term is losing some of its meaning, I think, or there's a lot of ambiguity, and that's because people are organizing in different ways. And so, in some ways, podding is not different really from what Black and Brown and Indigenous, people of color, immigrants, low-income communities have done for a long time, which is to act collectively to meet the kind of and privately to meet the childcare needs of their children, and often in opposition to racist school systems. So I think it's been kind of sometimes framed as something that is just happening among this wealthy elite, and that's the really problematic part of it. But I think that the idea of collectively working to care for our children, that underlying notion has always been there, and by necessity, in low-income communities of color. And so that hasn't been the media focus. It hasn't been the media focus, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And then they have these different levels, I think, of problematicness because of that, right? So yeah, Blanca, Dr. Blanca, hi.
No, I will. Hi, Eric. I've heard so much about you and read you on Twitter, so this is exciting for me. As you're talking, I'm thinking about all the, what this will mean for higher education, right? And the outcomes of this for higher education, and how we as higher ed administrators and faculty and researchers have to really consider how we think about admissions, for example. How we, and I really love that Dr. Turner brought up this idea that or the reality, right, that Black and Brown people have been doing this for generations, of trying to support each other, building smaller communities, but that doesn't get reflected on or is privileged in higher education admissions and education, right? We don't privilege that, but we do privilege the smaller classroom size, SAT prep, for example. So things that are monetized, things that are co-opted, such as, community building, and then put like an SAT brand on it, that does, we see, and we privilege that in higher education. So I think this is not just a moment for us to really rethink things and how we do things in K through 12, but then what are the consequences of that for higher education, and how we can then transform some of what we currently are doing to ensure that we are acknowledging and taking this into account.
I'm curious, actually, where do the three of you stand around the reopening of our schools, K through 12 and higher education? I'm curious because I think this very much has everything. The pod phenomena that we're experiencing or seeing now is very much, of course, directly in response to the conditions in which we are trying to educate students. But I was just curious, where do the three of you stand on that?
Yeah, so I'm here in New York City, and my eldest, both my children attend New York City public schools, and so it's been a difficult question to answer. For me, I know that there are a lot of pluses for my child being around their peers, for children having healthy interactions with adults, but also I'm not clear that we've established a good safety protocol for adults and children, nor am I clear that schools are equipped to handle just the general movement of kids in and around school in New York City. So as someone who is middle class, it is more easy for me to insulate myself from some of the hazards of COVID than a lot of folks who are lower income than me. And when I look at the plans that New York City DOE have rolled out, I think there's been a strong emphasis on trying to do face-to-face or to do virtual learning, but there hasn't been enough emphasis on how to connect to the communities that are in question, right? And the most vulnerable communities were left behind and left out when we went to online learning in the spring, and they've continued to be left out. And so I almost wish that we would resolve, we don't have what it takes to open up schools face-to-face, but we're making some strong inroads and making sure that communities that have the greatest need have the resources that they can to make sure that their children have safe, stable learning environments. And that can come in a variety of forms.
Absolutely. I think that's really important, is like who we're focusing on. Again, the potting situation can get focused on like what do white middle class, upper middle class parents want, and how can we respond to that? And then, the survey research seems to show, for example, Black families don't think the schools are safe to go to either. And this is different in different places because the virus is different in different places. But I think that in higher numbers, actually, Black families are concerned about that, and they're disproportionately impacted. So that makes sense. And again, it's race and class. But in Madison here, the schools have already decided to go virtual up through the end of October. And I think that's a good thing. But then again, as Dr. Liz McCoy was saying, like focusing on really what are the needs of the students who've been least well served by the virtual learning or the remote learning up to this point, or who need some sort of face-to-face. And in those situations, I think it makes sense to do so safely. From my perspective as an ed researcher, to have instances when you do face-to-face. But I mean, there's a lot of magical thinking going on here. And I'm, again, not giving health advice, but like the idea that private schools, even with their additional resources, are going to necessarily be able to open in places with high numbers of cases and not be still spreading the virus, I think is probably part of that magical thinking. Parents want kids to be in school, educators want kids to be in school. And it seems like it's taking a little while for that to really sink in. So that's not really safe and the right decision on a community-wide basis too.
Yeah. I come at this from a very personal perspective because my partner is a teacher in a private school. I have two stepchildren who are each in two very different schools. One is in a high school that's Catholic, and a Catholic high school, and the other one who's in a public school. And then my youngest who's in daycare. And, when we were first starting to have this conversation about like going back to school, we ended up thinking any of our children or my partner could be in right now because, they actually had a plan to, to clean and pick them up. Whereas I still haven't, there's still no clear plan for these other schools in which my family is a part of, right? There hasn't been a very detailed, there's only 8 o'clock drop off for parents whose last names start with V and, Z, for example. So, it really, it's, for me, it's very scary. And then the other, Montclair, where I'm a professor at, we were going to begin fully, like go in and teach classes. Not my department. We decided a long time ago that we were going to go online. But we just recently received a note from our dean saying that because New Jersey is still in stage 2 and hasn't moved on to stage 3, now we're going to go back to remote learning, right? So we're not even considering state policies around this, and then how different states are, really addressing this issue, right? At least here we are able to say, well, in New Jersey it's stage 2, stage 3. We don't even know what other states are going through right now, and how the schools are really using those state policies as guidance.
Oh, you were breaking up there,
right?
Blanca.
Or how to open or reopen their. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Should I call in?
That might be a little easier. Yeah, just voice wise. So,
okay.
So we'll come back to you, Blanca. So holding some space for Blanca, I wanted to turn it to Dr. Liz McCoy and Dr. Turner regarding, I had a question about the ways. So I'm thinking about state government, and you, Dr. Turner, you mentioned the role of imagination and thinking creatively. What has been your perspectives on how states, districts have responded to this? It's clear it has been exhausting and taxing on everyone. But I wondered, what do you all think has been the response from state agencies and leadership? Have they been creative in their responses, or has it been something else?
From my perspective, I've seen a dearth of creativity, at least in New York State, right? And we can talk about how different states have been creative, but how dangerous can be. For example, South Carolina, that's been creative in functionally allowing folks to leave public school and take their dollars to private school. But in New York, it has largely been about what they're defining as pragmatic decisions, right? So how do we safely do this? How do we get kids into school? And one of the things that concerns me about that is that we know when we had face-to-face instruction and when we had our kids in school, we knew that school wasn't a welcoming environment for all of them. It didn't work well for all families in the same way. And so the emphasis has largely been, how can we make this as normal as possible? And as a scholar, as a parent, as a Black man, I'm like, normal is not necessarily better. In fact, normal needs to be more than troubled. It has to be removed. And this may be the moment to rethink curriculum. This may be the moment to literally end school as we knew it, right? And actually get into a place where we are educating people. We are connecting to these communities that have been marginalized, that have been minoritized, that have been pushed to the side, and to center their experiences. Because if you start with the folks, I'm of the belief, if you start with the folks who are often most impacted by the forms of oppression, you build a better system and a more just system and a more whole one. But I haven't seen that happening in New York State, and I don't see it happening at a lot of state levels. I've seen some schools try to play with some things, but I think even schools are bounded by the districts and the other set of constraints that are around them.
Yeah, I'm on board with that. I think, it is. There's you don't want to say the pandemic is an opportunity, because it's not, in the way that, it's tragic. Many people are losing family members or having sustained healthcare needs. Maybe a third of the population is unemployed, but it is a time for something new, or for the potential for something new. And I think, just as you're saying, that this idea that, especially where it hasn't well served students, which is in a lot of places, that we should be thinking of something different, and we need to be. But largely what I've seen, and it's hard to know, every district is doing it themselves, and right there's a failure of leadership from the top right down to the states. There's been a real focus on safety and kind of the logistics of it. And first, the schools are really set up to lose in that situation, because they're already underfunded. We don't know a lot about how the virus really acts. And so I think a lot of places kind of thought, well, it'll hopefully be better. It's worse, in terms of the virus now than it was maybe at the beginning of the summer in most places in the country. And so there's kind of been limited creativity, in part, I think, because there's been a lot of focus on how to open schools safely. And I was, asking the Twitter sphere a little while ago, who knows places where they're talking about how can we do this in a different way? Because, partly just, as a parent, again, what did not work well was trying to engage kids over the internet in doing the same kind of things that they were doing in the classroom. You don't have the same authority if you're the teacher on the other side of the screen to kind of get them to do something they don't want to do. And so you're really much more dependent, I think, on engaging kids, them having resources to do things with that, but actually them being inherently motivated. So one principal I talked to said, we kind of know, we can tell what they're paying attention to in some cases, because they can monitor the technology, so that we can see through their device, district issued device, that they're logging on, but they're going to YouTube. They're not going to the e-learning platform. So to me, that says teachers were really just kind of in a do the best we can emergency situation in the spring. But now I think the expectation is different and the need is different, especially for students who already were struggling with school as it was, that there's something better and that the learning doesn't stop. So for some of us, and I include my kids kind of in that situation, if they don't really learn a ton, I think they'll still be learning something and they'll be okay. But this is the time to do something more engaging, to do things that are intrinsically interesting to kids. Things like, maybe Black history, understanding activism and organizing, especially in this moment, studying what the science is behind the coronavirus, or whatever it is, their communities, the land that they're on, et cetera. I've seen really interesting things around that. I don't think that's part of the larger district conversation, and it should be.
Do you all think that, so the other piece to this and what we've been talking about, and hopefully we'll be able to have Blanca. I think Blanca's on hold on the call. Dylan, our studio engineer, maybe they'll be able to get them back on. but as we're hopefully waiting for her to join us, the other question I think is equity, which is a lot of what all three of you have already been pointing to. Has the notion of equity really been a part of this conversation around reopening the schools safely? In your different, both in your research and in your different contexts that you are sending your kids to school in.
Yeah. Can I actually back up a little bit? Because
please, yeah.
I guess what I want to say is, one of the things that was also going on in the spring, and it's hard to know how widespread this was, but in a lot of districts, they got flummoxed around doing some of the basic things that are kind of schools are asked to do because we don't have a broader social welfare net. So delivering meals, right? And making just those kinds of basic things that we have relied upon kids being able to go to school in order to get meals. And that is one of our main mechanisms for ensuring that families are well fed. A lot of schools were grappling with that and not focusing on the pedagogical piece. And that's not, who's to say that's a bad thing to do? I think especially in the context where a lot of families are becoming unemployed on top of already, precarious situations. So when we think about equity too, I don't want that piece to get left behind. Schools, as imperfect as they are playing an important role because we don't have other, systems in place for securing kind of some of the basic needs kids have.
Thanks for that, Dr. Turner. So in thinking about that, then, what has the equity conversation then looked like as we have moved from the spring, where I agree, I think we've been really focused on, a lot of it was like, how can we keep people safe? How can we kind of survive? I felt much of it was like just kind of crawling to the summer was the win. But so as we have moved from that into the summer and now thinking about the fall, where are we with the equity question?
Yeah, from my perspective.
Can I add?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Vega.
No. You can go.
No. Go ahead, Dr. Vega. Welcome back.
Thank you. The conversation I feel like I have not seen yet, and, I've been sort of yelling about this on Twitter, is this idea that we've been, many of us, not just students, but faculty and administrators have been personally affected by COVID, right? Like our family members have passed, our family members have fallen ill, been hospitalized. And I feel that while, we're not addressing that part of this conversation, that, the majority of folks, not the majority, but largely, Black and Latino and Native American, folks have really been hit by this virus, right? And so we're coming into the fall, not with sort of this kind of blanket, how we're going to address these pedagogical and sort of these administrative issues, right? Without really thinking about how are we actually doing, right? How am I going to plan for the fall, when I have a family member in the hospital? How am I going to, and then what are students going through when they're the ones, and some of the students I know now have had to take the bulk of family responsibilities because, a family member has passed. And so I feel there's just this sort of silence around that while, yes, we have to take care of some of these administrative issues, and I completely agree with that. What kind of, accommodations are we, providing for, a group of people that have been seriously hit by this virus? I mean, in my own circle alone, there's, out of 5 of us, 3 of us lost family members. Like, and we're all, helping each other and holding space for each other. But, our colleagues have no idea what's going on, or if they do, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. Do you have time to grieve? But we got to plan for the fall. So I just feel like there's this huge silence around around that part of the conversation when it comes to thinking about equity. And I'll end there. I know that no one can see my face because I'm on the phone.
Thank you, Dr. Vega. Dr. Liz McCoy, did you have something?
Yeah, no, I think what both Dr. Turner and Dr. Vega said is spot on. We have traded a lot of our potential conversation around equity for what is logistically possible. And I think one of the reasons why the pandemic pods have opened a conversation about equity for me is that when we think about, and I do think there's something different in this moment of why we have these pods emerge. So communities that have historically not have access to a lot of material resources, we pull together and make do. But this pandemic has made everyone take the bulk of their schooling outside of the building. And as it's gone outside of the building, what people are often doing when they're forming these pods are using their own networks. So that means they're using networks that are segregated along racial lines, along ethnic lines, along class lines, along linguistic lines. And they're saying, hey, we're going to get together in the middle of this crisis, and maybe we'll form this pod and it'll be our life raft, right? But if your life raft only includes people who look like you, if your life raft only includes people who have the same language set as you, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Even in looking at my eldest's school, which is a bilingual school, invitations to pods are happening among English dominant families and not among families that are multilingual. And so for me, I'm like, whoa, major equity implication right off the bat. And then we also have folks who are in this moment of when everyone's forced to learn outside of school and create school. Some people are getting life rafts. Some folks are literally being left behind and just trying to tread water to survive. And we haven't paid enough attention. And then other folks are using resources to build speedboats, right? And they're kind of just plowing through the water. So we're in a moment where I keep on asking families to actively think about equity in ways that you normally wouldn't. Now, I think people should be thinking about equity every day. But the truth of the matter is that many folks are self-interested and they're like, my responsibility is to handle my child and make sure my child is doing well. And I want folks to make sure their child is doing well, but I want them also to interrogate, what are my choices and behaviors? How could they impact other sets of families? So there may be a way that you are forming a community around education that's hoarding an opportunity. You could potentially interrogate your networks, interrogate how segregated are we, and let's try to find a different constellation and build something more equitable. And this is where I think schools have the potential to assist in doing some of this work. And by saying, hey, look, we know you all are going to do this because communities are already doing it. It's not even a question of will they form pods or not. Pods are here. It's really a question of, do you have guidance around best practices? How do you get people to start to think about equity? How do you get people to think about not just this abstract, I want to invite someone indifferent from my kid, but how do you create a space that's inclusive? Teach folks how to work around equity and be able to answer, what is the question? What is the thing that you're sacrificing and giving up? Because equity itself, if you have more, you're going to have to give something up for someone else to have some. And if we're not having that conversation with parents and we're not having that conversation with districts, we're going to see the same unequal world that we live in. The gaps get wider and wider, faster and faster.
Dr. Turner,
Dr. Lewis McCoy,
Go ahead, Dr. Vega.
Yes, it's that last question that you said, we have to give something up in order to, make sure that everyone is taken care of in a way. And I think that's where people are stuck. They don't know what they have to give up, right? And even though some folks are very explicit in sort of in saying, this is what you may need to give up, your comfort, your whatever, for some folks, it's, they really they actually don't know. And I can say this, from, conversations that I've had, with folks of color, who are genuinely trying to figure out all these questions, but they're like, okay, well, is it money that I have to give up? Is it, is it time? Is it space? And I think that's also a conversation that should be guided a little bit more. If that makes any sense.
I mean, some folks on this very call are guiding us towards equity. I'm just saying.
Right.
That's a very nice segue, Dr. Lewis McCoy. Thank you. Dr. Turner, you and a cohort of colleagues have created this Equity in Pandemic Schooling, an action guide for families, educators, and communities. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that kind of guidance and what you all are trying to do to articulate, and I think to provide the kind of language that Dr. Vega, I think, is pointing to.
Yeah. Thank you, Edwin, and both of you for that setup. So I work with a group of other parents at my children's school. It's not really, I mean, it's informed, of course, by my research, but it's part of just kind of being a parent, and a Black parent, Black and Asian parent who, again, all of those things coming together, as Dumi said. And, in this group, we're kind of interested in how we can act for educational equity, especially racial equity at the school level. And we wanted to think about, in this time, what is the best way to do that as schools are developing their plans. At the time, we didn't know what the plan was going to be in our district. But wanted to make sure that this kind of concerns were on the table. And then also just like, what should we be doing as parents? So this is the guide that we wanted to see, that we wanted for ourselves. And it's intended for families, educators, and community members who are concerned about inequity and injustice in education, and about how these are being exacerbated on the pandemic, because it already was here. And then who want to take action to do something about it. And the challenges feel really daunting, I'll say, as somebody who has 3 kids, 10 and under, and the equity imperatives cut in multiple directions. So it's not like just a straightforward kind of do this, right? So we focus this. It's got specific steps that I think people kind of across lines of race and class can take, but it's really intended for those folks who are relatively privileged. They've got, they're employed right now. They don't necessarily have this extended set of community members who are currently feeling the realities of the pandemic, or they are really privileged in that they're not experiencing racial violence. They're not experiencing immigrant deportation, as a lot of families are. This is like the compounded harms that are going on right now that often even are invisible to a lot of folks who aren't in them. So these are kind of aimed at people who have a little more resources, bandwidth to act at this moment. And the full guide is about 18 pages. It outlines kind of 4 distinct areas of equity and justice, ones that we've already kind of talked about here, but broadly speaking, this kind of privatization that creates a system that kind of recreates some of the white flight and opportunity hoarding that Dumi has written about and talked about here, the undermining of public education, and then therefore the undermining kind of the systems that we have to educate those with the least, and that make our public, make our civic life. The ongoing racism, especially anti-Black racism in schools, right? That's not ending, that we can expect to see also happen within virtual or hybrid or remote schooling. In fact, this case of the young woman Grace in Detroit, who's being a Black disabled woman, who's then caged or in prison, jailed because she does not attend classes, right, is an example of how this criminalization of Black youth, Black disabled youth, it just gets kind of shifted over into the virtual realm, right? So those things don't end. That's a major problem. And then the disproportionate stress and work of childcare, because of course what this has done is created what was schooling now also a childcare challenge for many families, and one that disproportionately is going to impact mothers and disproportionately impact low-income families, working class families, especially if they're disproportionately in these essential services, et cetera. And maybe with multi-generational families, as Jimmy's pointed out, creating also this challenges around safety and health for those families. So there's a lot of those kinds of problems. None of them are new. They're heightened under the pandemic. And so we wanted to shift the conversation of equity around for the kind of pod question the pod parent might be asking themselves, which is like, what do I do for my own child, and that isn't in a way that isn't quite so inequitable, And that kind of frames the issue as an individual decision and an individual level action. It is, but we're punting on that a little bit in the guide to kind of say, reframe it as an equity question with a collective and a structural challenge behind it. And so in the guide, we're arguing collective, structural, equitable change. Okay, what are some things you can do for that? And we kind of have more or less crowdsourced 10 different broad actions. First, a couple things that can kind of address healthy, supported communities. Like, this is our baseline, right? If we have this virus running rampant, if we don't have the resources schools and families need to make learning happen, we will not have equitable pandemic schooling. So those are kind of the first couple steps address that need, just to get the schools in a place where they could provide a safe learning environment, and the communities in a place where kids aren't dealing with that, families aren't dealing with that health, the trauma, the death associated with the coronavirus, and that those conditions don't also make it unsafe to have schools open. And then the second set is about, like, let's have an education worth having, right? This is the, safe but engaging, caring, and equitable, knowing the trauma, knowing that especially Black and brown families have been poorly served by the existing curriculum, pedagogy, etc., needing a safe place. How can we advocate to have that? And then how can we support public schools? Not undermine through privatization, but support through public schools. And that's going to be getting engaged. So different ways of kind of pushing forward schools to be better than they are now. And not just safer, but again, in ways that are more anti-racist, more equitable, more caring, more just. And then the fourth overall thing is, like, let's increase our impact. So again, because we live in such segregated by race and class communities, and our schools often reflect that, and our social networks do, you just work with the people that you know in your own schools, it won't be as impactful, right? It's more likely that you're going to just be lifting up the people like yourselves instead of redistributing some of the resources and other things that need to happen. And so reaching out to Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations that are often already doing this work, advocating, understand the needs, as Dumi said, like starting with understanding what are the needs, and then linking up to other people and really trying to act collectively, organizing in that way. So those are kind of, there's specific steps, but those are the broad categories and kind of thinking behind them, or goals behind the work. And we have a flyer that also goes through the specific steps that we're trying to push out there. I think these are all things that even before the pandemic and after it happens are still going to be needed. So it's aimed at, like, what can we do right now? But I don't want people to think like, okay, pandemic's over, now let's go back to our segregated suburbs and, or whatever, and think that we've done the thing. No. And then just at the end, it's kind of a call to action, asking people to kind of rethink this little refrain that we hear a lot, like, I'm not going to sacrifice my own child, and really reframing that, re-emphasizing that need to put something on the line, like Blanca said, right? Put something on the line, and it could be your time, it could be your resources, it could be time and resources, it can be that idea of getting ahead, and actually that the rewards instead, the kind of doing what's best for your child, isn't going to be about that extra year of math class or semester of math class, but the rewards come from what they're learning from watching you in this moment, seeing you act in community for something beyond yourselves, doing this kind of work, and then the kind of future that it might help to create. That's just kind of how I approach it as a parent myself, and thinking about these kind of questions is, no, I don't need to get the best, the most, the thing that no one else has, the advantage over every other family. I already am, as a professor, in a privileged position. And what I want for my kids instead is that they grow up in a community where there isn't this injustice, this inequality, that they believe in those things that they work in. That's the lessons they're learning too. So that's kind of just how we're ending and trying to kind of rethink and reframe these conversations, but really give people pretty tangible things that they can do. Write to Congress, ask for universal broadband, ask for the funding that schools need to go back safely, and work with other people to do that.
We're coming up to our last segment of the show, and we could spend time unpacking each and every one of these pieces that Dr. Turner you've articulated here. But just briefly, I wondered then, in the immediate, you're speaking to parents, you're engaging parents. I guess I wanted to talk about two things, hopefully, in this last 10 minutes or so. One is the parents, right? So you are engaging, and I know all three of you are doing this in various capacities in your own locations already. So what are the conversations that you're having with parents to get them to kind of bring them to the water to drink and to actually spend time reflecting? What should we be doing to facilitate these kind of conversations in our communities?
I thought Dr. Vega was going to jump in, so I'll jump in right here. So I take a slightly different approach than Erica, in that I like to go to folks who have a lot and make them rethink what they have, right? And start from a question of, what can you give up and get by with, right? You could probably give up a whole lot and get by, but I may ask you to give up a little bit so someone else has some more, right? So things don't totally get taken off the table. So I ask folks, whether you are financially wealthy or not, as you're forming these pods, look at the forms of segregation that are there. And if you have 4 families and all of them are college educated, full stop. Because that doesn't match, more likely than not, the demographics of your school. So that could be someone who comes from a number of different identities, but sometimes your educational attainment puts you in a different place. So we have to rethink that. I also ask people to think about, what are the lessons you want to teach to your child in this moment of crisis? You can turn on the news, it's doom and gloom. Out your windows, you see doom and gloom. This is the moment to teach your child the strength of community and how collectively people pull together, even unexpected ways, right? So I talk a lot to families, and I say things like, this is the time where your kid can actually see you be a hero, because you extend yourself in a way that they didn't think was possible for you, but they see you working with other families who may pass by. They see you being in conversation with your school in different ways. Yes, you are often in conversation with your school, lobbying for the best teacher. You are often doing things that hoard opportunities. What would it mean to raise your voice and ask different questions of your school? What would it mean to listen to the families that have been now saying for months on end, hey, this ain't working? And say, okay, well, let's get you at the center of the conversation. So I encourage people to give up a little. I encourage people to literally be superheroes in this moment. I encourage people to step back and to center the voices of those whom we often silence. And if you can start to do those things within your own networks, within the place that you stand, I think we can get a little bit of movement in this crisis. I don't think in doing those things, or even in combination with the larger structural and institutional pushes that Eric has given, we're not going to eliminate the disparities in the midst of this crisis. I'm just like, we got to mitigate something, because this is a dangerous thing that we're going to be dealing with arguably for decades to come.
Yeah, and I think that for many of us, and I'm listening to Dr. Lewis McCoy and Dr. Turner, talk about really specific questions and plans, and I've been just listening really intently, because the best thing that I'm feeling like I can do as a parent right now, and as an educational researcher, is to get other parents. Maybe it's not like a pod specifically for a specific school, right? But to get other parents to be involved in this kind of conversation. One of the ways that we've been trying to do this is by Nestor Melendez, who's a higher ed administrator, at CUNY. He and I have been putting together sort of like this weekly, and we've been on hiatus for about a month because I needed the space. But we've been talking to other parents about, what are their plans for, for the upcoming fall, and, supporting each other in that way. Like if someone needed a referral for somebody, or to even have these kinds of conversations, like to point to people like, oh, Dr. Turner has this great resource. We should look at that. We should maybe review that the next time we all meet again. I think that there's different ways in which we can engage parents and kind of get them to really understand this as an equity issue. Because as Dr. Lewis McCoy had pointed out earlier, and in a lot of his opinion pieces, that a lot of folks really begin with, how am I going to get out of this, right? How am I going to make it? But then when we have a group of people sort of asking the same question, right? When we have a group of parents asking the same question, we realize that it's not just how am I going to make it, but how are we going to get through this, right? And who are the folks who are doing the work to ensure that we get through this, in a way that we're taken care of, right? That our needs are taken care of in the sense that we're healthy and first, and that our mental health needs are taken care of as well, and then our educational needs, right? So it's a lot of, I think it's a lot of just having that conversation with different parents and say, where are you at on this, right? Kind of like what you asked, Dr. Mayorga, very, very much like, where are you all at when it comes to this question? And I think without that, we can't really figure out what's going on in our communities.
I think you all are really hitting on what I describe as organizing, and mutuality, solidarity kind of work, which I think is all really important. And we're almost out of time here. I was wondering, well, two things very quickly. I'm trying to sneak in a third one. What should we be doing with the families? We've been kind of talking around the more privileged families, or kind of focusing on what they should be doing, and I think rightly so. I'm wondering about the agency of the more marginalized families. Whether it be racially, economically, linguistically, and so on. How can we facilitate and think about what kind of conversations need to be had with them, as we're trying to really kind of build this solidarity kind of work?
One of the things that we talk about in the guide and that we're trying to do at our own schools, and this is shout out to the parent group that I work with, which is the Lapham Marquette PTG, parent teacher group, the Equity and Action Committee. And, that was the structure was available. That's the structure we've organized under, and it's working so far relatively well. But for our own school, what we're pressing on and moving forward is trying to really get a good understanding of the needs of every single family in the school. So again, I think that idea of that Dumi was mentioning, like if you're just talking to your own circle, you're most likely not getting at that. That every single family is contacted by someone, and that from their perspective, we get what is needed, and then that we can organize around that and mutually sharing the resources we have towards that end. So I think that's just kind of, I think organizing work, mutuality, like you're saying, is a big part of that.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it takes first us to listen in different and better ways than we often do. So I look at New York City in the spring when everything shut down and schools were shut down, but the essential work of many of the most vulnerable families were not. When folks are delivering food, bagging groceries, working in healthcare, they figured out a way how to survive, and they often survived outside of the things that New York City set up. But we didn't ask those families, what did you do to survive? And why wasn't that attractive? If we start with that question, then we can actually figure out what needs to be built out more clearly here, right? Because it may be a matter of childcare. It may be a matter of distance and accessibility, right? There are very local questions that we have to ask ourselves. And oftentimes people who get to drive the conversation, we have to have other people in the room and be like, hey, let's slow down and back up, because these narratives are not present. And without those narratives and without those voices, we're literally trying to fill in holes of missing data with our own ego. And so I think that it takes a lot of humbling, and for schools and communities to look and say, who hasn't been in the room, who hasn't been heard, and what have we done to exclude? And once you can do that, I think you actually can build what you need.
We've got like, oh, go ahead, Dr. Vega, quickly. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, very quickly. I just want to say, and I think we need to stop including words like resilient and strong and, and grit and all that stuff when it comes to these kinds of conversations. Like for some of us, it's literally life and death, right? I don't need to be resilient through that. Like I don't want to be. And I think once we remove that kind of language from our conversations, I think we can get to the questions that Dr. Turner and Dr. Lewis McCoy are asking. Once we okay, let's take that away for a minute and then see well, what is it that they need? How did they get through this? And why did they have to get through that in that particular way?
One last quick question, and maybe you have about 30 seconds to respond, each of you, but I'm curious then, what should our leadership, government on all levels, where should we have, there's scarcity of resources right now for a variety of different reasons in certain areas. And a lot of it revolves around this, or part of it revolves around the continued abandonment and disinvestment in our public schools that has been happening for decades, if not nearly a century. What then where should the money that states and cities and school districts have, where should they be directing that money right now? In a word.
In a word, it's got to be progressive taxation. You have to direct it to the schools and the families that have the highest need. The same schools in New York State that they stopped paying money towards when the financial crisis hit. The same schools out in California, they slowed up putting progressive dollars into once COVID hit. COVID-19 is one thing. COVID-45 is another. We have a federal government that is trying to dissolve public schools and call them government schools. And we have to fight back at every turn and say, this is going to be the most expensive school year we've had in a long time. And it should be, because we need clear guidance on how to be safe, how to do good learning, and how to make sure folks wade through the water to get to another day.
Dr. Vega, Dr. Turner?
I think that, I agree with Dr. Lewis McCoy here. We're talking, I think this is a hot summer, where we're talking about, defunding police, where we're talking about making sure our kids are safe. And not just our kids, but our teachers. Like I said, my partner is a teacher. You know what I mean? I don't feel safe with him going back to school. He has to go back to school every day, he said. Even if he has to teach, online, he has to teach from the school. Right. And, so I'm not, I don't feel safe with, with folks who are, in these, these categories where we've seen that we're most afflicted by this pandemic. So it has to be in the safety of our people. Right. And if we can't do that, then, we can't teach, we can't administer, we can't send our kids to school without making sure that our children are safe. And in fact, I was saying earlier, and I still hold true to this, but I almost feel safer sending my child to daycare if I have to than to other schools, because at least they have a plan. There's a plan for safety. There's a plan for, for health. Whereas I haven't seen that from other schools yet. So.
Dr. Turner?
Yeah, I mean, I reiterate or agree with, what Lewis McCoy and Dr. Vega have said. I think, one of the issues, though, is that it's going to take more money, not less. The federal government is the only level of government that actually can ensure we have that money. And they've done it for corporations. So it's time to do it for low-income, working-class people. communities that need it and have been systematically disenfranchised and dispossessed. I mean, it's a political problem, political solution. But I think if we're looking to press somebody on that, it has to be at the federal level to provide those resources. And I think safety is, personal health. We can't do the learning, and if families don't have that security, rent, food, health care, all of those. So I guess that's not one thing. Sorry.
You all violated the 30-second rule that I had set out. I just want to note that.
Oh, you request rule, so we had free reign.
I was inviting imagination and creativity. This is the problem when you get all these academics sitting in a room, sleep deprived parent academics. So we are out of time. But I'm Edwin Mayorga. I want to thank my guests, Dr. Erica O. Turner, Dr. Blanca Vega, Dr. R. LaRue Dumi, Lewis McCoy. Thank you to our studio engineer, Dylan De Rosato, for their support. Thank you for listening, audience, to Encuentros Políticos, Political Encounters on usalamedia.com. If you have comments or questions about the show, you can find me on the web at edwin.mayorga.net, on Twitter at eimayorga, or by email at edwin.mayorga@gmail.com. Join us on Sundays at 5 p.m. Eastern on usalamedia.com, or download the podcast or episodes on Spreaker. And you can find this one on our Usala Media YouTube. Thank you. Palante.
Thank you
all.
Thank you.
All right, everyone.